This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, or so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. This week's episode is another good one, yet again. Michael Caulfield, like myself, came into sports psychology later in his life. In his case, after spending many years in horse racing circles. He's worked with some big names in football management, and he goes on to share some fascinating insights into his work. It's a must-listen episode for aspiring sports psychologists and those interested in the field and in football. I thoroughly enjoyed recording this. It gave me some lovely, timely reminders, and I hope it does for you too. Enjoy. Hi, Michael. It's great to meet you. I was wondering if you could share with the listeners, to start with, your background and your passion for sports psychology, where it came from.
It came by accident, and I mean that. There was no plan behind it at all, and I mean no plan behind it. It was based on a couple of chance conversations, and in my formative years, I was the chief executive, it sounds very grand, of an organisation called the Professional Jockeys Association, which, if you follow football, was the PFA of horse racing, or the Professional Cricket Association of cricket. It was the trade union looking after the flat and jump jockeys, male and female, in the UK, and I did that for 15 years. And during that time, a couple of outstanding jockeys came along, were champions. One was called Richard Dunwoody, and one was called A.P. McCoy. And Richard Dunwoody, when he was trying to be champion in 1994, asked me to find him a sports psychologist. So I used the phone directory because it was pre-digital, Google wasn't even in existence. And we found him, Professor Peter Terry, in Brunel University, London, and he used him. And when he became champion, he thanked him on the podium. And everyone was shocked that a rough, tough, hard-nosed jump jockey could want to go and see a psychologist. But he did. And then a guy called A.P. McCoy came along, who raised the bar even higher than Richard had. And he too went to see some sports psychologists, but he found the process a bit baffling and disappointing. So he came to see me one day. We were going for a walk where I live now, in Lambourne, where he lives. And he said, if you were a psychologist, I'd pay to see you because you understand my madness and our madness. And on the very back of that random conversation and random little outburst from him, I thought, well, if he says I'd be good at it, I'll try it. So I started training, and a number of years later, I got my degrees and accreditations, and off I went as a sports psychologist. And that conversation took place, I believe, in 1999.
Wow.
I didn't leave school with dreams of going to university. I didn't go to university until I was 40. So I'm doing it in my latter years. You know, I'm now, you've worked out the maths for yourself. I went to a university when I was 40, and that was 20 years ago. So, I came to it late in life, which actually, looking back, is a real advantage. Yeah,
likewise, I had a career change and got into it when I was early 30s when I did the change. And again, I think it's been beneficial in that way.
Yes.
In terms of yourself, and so when you first got into it, did you have more of a focus around horse racing, or were you?
No, I'd done 20 years in horse racing, riding the horses in the morning, and then as the chief executive of the Jockeys Association. And racing is very well catered for by the organisations within racing, like the Injured Jockeys Fund, of which I'm now a trustee, and I've attended a meeting this morning. So it's come completely full circle. My ambition was to go and work in my first love of life, which was mainstream team sports. I was brought up on Match of the Day back in the 60s and 70s, and the big match. And I dreamt of, working with a team involved in a cup final, which was the only game on TV back in those days. So football, rugby union, rugby league, cricket, golf, all horse racing as well, all the sports that I had an interest in growing up. I wanted to see if I could eventually break into them, because I thought that if I could deal with jockeys who are quite temperamental because they're very hungry and injured most of the time and broke in many ways, physically and mentally and financially, if I could do that, I might have a chance of working in other sports. So I transferred the skills, and with some luck and some hard work and some good fortune and some bad luck too along the way, I've managed to carve a career out for the last 20 years and hope to do so for a bit longer yet.
So can you just share as well your route into football? Because we're specifically going to try and hone in on this topic in the podcast.
Well, there was a strong relationship, maybe not as strong now, but you can still mention the likes of Sir Alex Ferguson, who had a huge interest in horse racing. But certainly in the 80s and the 90s, a lot of footballers and football managers and football people enjoyed their racing. So much so that if you went to Anfield or Old Trafford back in the day before kickoff, they wouldn't be watching Football Focus. They'd be watching the ITV7 and BBC Racing with Peter O'Sullivan. So I'd met a lot of people in football through horse racing. And two lucky breaks. One, a football agent who had an interest in horse racing telephoned me to say, I gather you've qualified and you've changed track. Could you help one of my players, please? Who's currently in the Premier League. So I did, and that went okay. And then a jockey back in 1996 won the Grand National called Graham Lee, and he was based up in Teesside, just south of Middlesbrough. And when he won the Grand National, even though he won it that year and he rode 100 winners and was very successful, he actually never thought he'd pushed himself physically, and he wanted to see if he could get himself very fit. But in those days, we had no training centres, rehab centres, which we do now for jockeys. So I got on the phone and I spoke to the head of sports science, Chris Barnes, at Middlesbrough Football Club. I rang the club office, the training ground, and Sue answered, who I got to know later, and because she worked there when I worked there. And Graham Lee trained in his spare time in the afternoons under Chris's guidance at Middlesbrough, at Rockcliffe. And so one day I said, Barnes, it would be lovely to see Graham in action and meet you, and I'd love to come to a football club. I've never been to one. It's always been, I'd love to. He went, well, I'll see what I can do. So he spoke to a couple of people and he said, yep, next week, turn up Tuesday morning. So I did. And I drove all the way up to Middlesbrough, stayed with Graham overnight, drove into Middlesbrough the next morning, met Chris, who showed me around. And when training started and when he showed me around, every player was out training. It was towards the end of the season, and Middlesbrough had, would you believe, they had reached the UEFA Cup final, the last of the UEFA Cups before Europa Leagues took over. And they're playing Seville in Rotterdam in the final of the UEFA Cup. And the captain of that side was Gareth Southgate, but he was injured and he'd missed a couple of games, unlike him. And he was on the treatment table. So the only player not training that morning was Gareth Southgate. And because I wasn't watching training, because there was no reason why I should, I just started talking to this player on the treatment table. And we got on well. And he asked my phone number at the end of it. And that was the end of that. And I drove home. And 6 months later, he rang up and said, I'm manager now. There's been a big changeover of staff. Would you like to come and help me as part of my support staff? So I got back in the car and drove to Middlesbrough and stayed there for 3 years. And that was the start of my work in football. So please don't tell me that luck doesn't have a lot to do with life, because luck and timing plays a huge element in anyone's life, because you have to meet the right person at the right time, the right circumstance, and make the right impression. And that might enable you to start forming a relationship. And it did.
Yeah, and obviously that's got to be the key factor, isn't it? Where you talk about relationships and being able to build those relationships with those type of people.
Yeah, and also it was a 600-mile round drive. There was nothing in it for me other than 600-mile round drive to see Graham, to meet Chris. And gosh, what were we now, 24 years later? I drove to, before lockdown, I drove to Edinburgh on an off chance and back, which is a longer drive than even the Middlesbrough, because you just keep going up the A1, hit the M74 and keep going. So I drove to Edinburgh and back for a chance meeting, not a chance meeting, an organised meeting with an international coach. And he too then chose to use me several months later. So I still keep saying to anyone who wants to have a career in any walk of life, but particularly sport and sports psychology, it will not come to you. You have to go to it. And it will not come to you via LinkedIn or any workshop you attend or webinar. I still think in sport, which is very personal, very private, you still have to go and meet people, see people, of which 9/10 of the journeys are a complete and utter waste of time. But the one that comes off might open up a whole new world for you. And even though fuel is now 185 a litre and the rest of it, you've still got to go and see people, meet people, and present yourself to people, because sport is about people and relationships. Even though people tell you it's not anymore, it is. And we can all talk about the corporate language which has overtaken sport, which is a grave error in my behalf. And you can talk about your stakeholders and your KPIs and all that goes with it. it will always come back to you meeting people and making an impression upon them, as is psychology. So it might be a little bit old fashioned for some, but that's how I still think it works.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. And I suppose you hit on a point there where you talked about dealing with failure and rejection, just like a footballer, a centre forward could miss 9 times and then finally score on their 10th opportunity and keep going and keep going. You've obviously had to do that as a sports psychologist. You
do, because there's some months which are a little bit barren, to be honest with you, because in the main, we're mostly self-employed because we're consultants. If you get the chance to work for a governing body or an organisation and get a full-time role, take it with every possible hand you have to grasp it. Otherwise, probably like yourself, David, you have to find work and invoice for work and deliver good work. And that sometimes it goes up and down. You have great months and you have quieter months. So you have to get used to that and rejection and people saying no. And life is actually about that as well, because everyone else in sport only ever talks about winning and the winning mindsets and the winning culture and high performance. And actually sport a lot of the time is about rejection and getting beaten and handling that. And I've got several PhDs in getting beat, I can assure you. And it's not always about the comfortable stuff. And you have to go through that really, edgy, is this going to work moment before you get to the other side. If you get to the other side, because you never quite get to that. I don't think you ever quite get to the other side. It's just always a process to keep going. Always. On that score, then, what would you say is your definition of mental toughness in a football context? I would say two things. Off the pitch, it's the ability to deal with the scrutiny and the criticism and the howling gale of criticism that will come your way, because it will. If you work in football, if you play or coach in football, you have to learn to deal with the relentless scrutiny and comments which you wouldn't use in any other walk of life at all. On the pitch, it's still having the courage to want the ball when you're having a horrible game, a horrible run, a horrible season, a horrible period of form. You can't. The ball feels like a hand grenade. It's the size of a golf ball. You don't know what's going to happen next. But the courage to go out and still want to have the ball and perform when nothing, and I mean nothing, is going your way, is a sign to me of resilience and mental toughness. And those are answers you won't find in any academic journal either, because you won't get that sort of comment in an academic journal. You just wouldn't. But you have to deal with the side of football which no one likes, but you have to learn to deal with it. And that's the rejection, the defeat, the scrutiny, and the criticism. And once you're on the pitch, you must want the ball, because if you don't, it will eventually blow up in your face. So I know you've worked with and supported different managers, obviously, and players. Could you just give an insight into the managerial role and as you say, the criticism, the challenges, and how you as a sports psychologist would help a football manager? I've worked with 5, I think, really, and that's, I can list them. I'd like to work with Gareth Southgate, Steve Bruce, Mick Phelan, Dean Smith, and now Thomas Frank. All very different personalities, different stages of their career, different backgrounds, different philosophies. It's a very lonely job being a coach, particularly a head coach. And in the main, my job is to support and understand and encourage, of course, and listen. Now and again, which is once a year, probably maybe twice at most, to say, have you got a minute? And they say, what? And you go, you might not want to hear this, and you deliver a bit of feedback, to use the current word, which no one else in the club might offer, because they could be his assistant coach or the head of medical or whatever, and they're nervous to give that feedback to say, are you sure we've got this right? Not in terms of tactics and selection, I never get involved with that. But if their behaviour is slightly erratic or not helping them or the team or their own career, I've got to step in and say, now and again, careful here, because otherwise they're like the pilot being told that the plane's going to crash, but no one's got the courage to tell him or her. So you have to have the courage to speak up and help them, particularly when it's going not so well, because I've worked for 3 clubs and I've been involved in 3 promotions, playoffs from the championship, but also some relegations too. So I'd like to think I know when to interrupt when we're going well and when we're not going so well. And that takes experience, that takes courage, because you won't always get it right, but it's your duty to speak up and to support particularly in times of adversity.
So in some ways, as the sports psychologist, you've got to be able to park your ego to one side and try not to put them on a pedestal as well. In effect, look at them on an equal playing field.
It's a good point, because there's some quite well-known names in that list, of which I'm very proud that that they've become people I still talk to and respect. You can't put them on a pedestal, because then you're just fawning at them and looking, oh gosh, aren't they amazing? You just have to see them as what they are, which is the head coach of an organisation. And as a head coach of any organisation, the one thing they're guaranteed to do is make mistakes. There's a piece of some research out there which says 80% of the time they make mistakes or make the wrong decision. I don't get involved, I stress, in selection and tactics and recruitment, because that's not my job. It really isn't. But my job is to support and encourage and correct and give feedback when it's necessary and appropriate. So I do. Do I always get it right? Absolutely not. But I always do it with the best intentions.
So you've mentioned the word courage quite a few times there. So let's talk about players in general here. So supposing, again, a player's been vilified, he's got his own fans on his back, his confidence is low. How do you go on to help him have that courage to demand the ball, to move around and be involved in a game?
Two things. The player, of course, might not want to talk to you. And I've got no embarrassment to say that, because, again, this is one of the biggest challenges of working in football in a club. If I work for player X and I'm not involved in the club at all, it could be easier because he will trust you implicitly. Football is a little bit different, because if you are employed by the club, they're always a little bit nervous and wary that you might, if they tell you something which they think will hinder their selection or their contract, then will they open up to you? So sometimes they don't want to talk to you. But the analogy I often use, in fact, I always use, is if you go running after people, there's a very good chance they'll run further away from you. If you wait for your moment, and those moments often come because they just happen to arrive, and then a conversation could be started by you asking an interesting, open, engaging, even silly question. And eventually it leads to a further conversation, and then they'll go, God, I tell you what, just at the minute, and you're off. But it's a bit like catching an animal out in the wild, or trying to catch a horse or get your dog back. If you go demanding it comes back to you, more often than not, it won't. If you sit quiet in the corner of a field or whatever, eventually the animal will come to you because it's interested in you and it wants to know what you're doing there. And I find that very, very helpful in football. It means you might miss a few, but if you can't force yourself upon them, they have to want to come and talk to you. And if they do, then you can do your best work. And I find that works for me. And there's people who know me, and David, you've noticed this, that I never have a desk at a training ground or an office or even a tracksuit. I dress in my everyday normal clothes. If I work for a club, I don't want a desk or a room. I just walk and float around. I even take my dog to work with me, and then we might just head off for a dog walk now and again. And people will tell you much more on a dog walk than they will sat in any office. So my way isn't for everyone. It's slightly unconventional, but I find that it's the best to get people trusting you. So that's what I do.
Yeah, because it must be difficult for a player to trust you as a sports psychologist in a team, because they'll be wary, as you say, about selection, about coaches, and your relationship with a coach. It must be quite tough, because you're going to have to...
It's not much tough. It's about trust, and it takes a long time to gain trust. And I am wary every day I work in sport. Wary, aware of it, not nervous of it. But the most important thing I can do is build trust. And if you build trust, you have a chance. If there's no trust, you have no chance. So every conversation, every moment I'm at a training ground or with a player or a coach, I've got the little light bulb telling me this is about trust. So never, ever, ever betray that trust. Ever. You can't. You mustn't. It's unethical and wrong in every single way. So building trust is the biggest challenge I think any psychologist will have in a team sport.
Do you find in many of the clubs and organisations that you've worked in team sports, that you might have a lot of like three-way conversations between yourself, the player, and the coach? Or is it more, I
think you can expand it. You might go seven-way conversation, because it might involve the head of medical, the doctor, the physiotherapist, the strength and conditioning coach, the nutritionist, the chef, you name it. So I suppose the correct word is multi-disciplinary, but I would just call it just being very open with people and you will invite opinions and invite questions. And not more often than not, but on a number of occasions in football, my input has been 100% overruled and rejected. And at first I thought, well, that means I'm no good and I can't help. But actually the following week, it might be accepted. The insight you might have could be very helpful to the coaches and the support staff. So I'd also say to any aspiring psychologists, don't be afraid to speak up. But if your ideas are not wanted or accepted at that particular time, it's not because it's a bad idea, you're no good. It just wasn't right at that particular moment. And I've had a couple of instances in the last 2 seasons where I've come up with an absolute masterstroke, I think, in my opinion. But both times it was just, Michael, not now. And guess what? They were right. They were right. It wasn't, but I wasn't being over enthusiastic. I was just trying to help, as you tried to do. But the input I wanted to make, both managers and both sets of staff said, not now. Good idea, but not now. And I accepted that. And by the way, they were right. But at least I had, dare I say, if you find yourself being able to speak freely and openly, then you're doing your job, and so are they.
So in some ways, again, as a sports psychologist, although you tell players, you'll tell coaches to watch your own internal dialogue, your self-talk, you've got to be able to do that yourself, because it would be very easy to become quite down on yourself. And
absolutely. And again, David, I'm enjoying this now. You've got to be very wary of your own self-talk and your own thoughts, because I'll be honest with you, there's days and parts of the decision you think, God, am I adding anything this morning or this afternoon or to this meeting? And sometimes you don't. In fact, there was one particular day, more than once this has happened, not just in football, it's happened in every team sport I've worked in. Every coach at some stage of the week or the month or the season, Michael, what are you up to today? And rather than say, oh yeah, I've been really busy, I've had 6 one-on-ones and I've solved the world, I've said more than once, in fact, on a number of occasions, I've said, to be honest with you, not a lot. And every time the coach or the support staff have gone, that's okay, that's good. Pleased to hear that. In fact, one has said, brilliant, delighted. And you feel a bit fraudulent because you're working and you think, I haven't really done much. But the fact that you've not wanted on that day and no one wants to really engage you too much, that's okay as well. You don't have to be busy and creating problems to solve every day. You really don't. And in fact, that would be my 2 or 3 top tips to pass on. Don't think you've got to justify your job. Or as one manager told me in a team meeting a few years ago after a run of 8 games now to win, he said to all the support staff, including me, he said, listen, you lot, I know how you feel. Don't go around justifying your job. Just do it. You haven't got to justify to me that you're cooking the meals well, or you're doing the physio well, or you're doing the conditioning well, or you're doing the rehab well, or you're being a good side. Don't justify it. Just do your job to the best of your ability. And everyone calm down.
In effect, trust the process.
Trust the process. Yeah. And as I keep stressing, unless you work for Man City or Liverpool, maybe one or 2 other teams, much of the time you're on the back of a defeat or a period of disappointing form, because in most of the leagues, most of the teams are not in the top 2, winning 4 games out of 5, averaging 2.4 points a game. It just doesn't happen like that.
So where would your role come in there? In a team environment where, the team's losing more than they're winning, what sort of tools have you got up your sleeve?
I think patience is one. In managing your emotion and their emotion is important too, because that's why I don't go in every day, I don't think I'd ever want to go into a club every day, because then you get sucked into that same think. And I know feedback from my role of working in a club once, maximum twice a week, is that by staying away, you bring clarity and objectivity when you do go in, because you're not listening to every conversation which says, God, we haven't won for 9 games and he's not playing very well and she's not playing very well and that he's not doing his job. So you've got to try and remain semi-independent, but also very rational when others are probably a little irrational, because losing a lot does have an effect on people, including me. And I've got to be very wary of that too, because you've got to present yourself not as this silly person. I think it's fine, it's great, isn't it? Isn't it amazing? The best time of our lives. You haven't won for 3 months, because it's not the best time of your life when you haven't won for 3 months. It really isn't. You think it's the worst time of your life. So you've got to get your language right. You've got to get your interventions right. You've got to get the timing is crucial, and how you react to people's frustrations too.
I can imagine as a football manager in that situation, when you haven't won for a long time, then you could have the weight of the world on your shoulders and the weight of all the staff, the players, the club as a whole.
Look, how many managers have we heard talk at the end of a season or when they even left a club? And they said they didn't know how much it had taken out of them until they walked away or until they had a break. We even heard Jurgen Klopp say recently, on the eve of the Carabao Cup final at Wembley, in a big interview, he said at the end of the last season, when they finished runner-up, I think, but they had another good season. He said, I was sick and tired of football. I didn't want anything to do with it. He was literally exhausted. And that's working for Liverpool. And they've averaged 90 points a season for the last 3 years. And they're quite good at football at the moment. Liverpool, they're involved in every competition and every league, and they're pretty good. But even he was absolutely broken by it come the end of a long season. And that's at a successful club. So I now also know what it does to people when they're winning one game in 3 and scraping their way to 40 points. The pressures are intolerable, and you can help them through that because they get exhausted. Mentally, they are exhausted.
Yeah. Actually, you've got a point there. It's amazing. Like when you see them, maybe if they have lost their job, you see them in the press, and then after they've had a holiday for a few months, they look a different person, completely refreshed.
Well, we've seen pictures in recent weeks and months of a manager leaving a post and then being photographed with their family a week later, and you barely recognise them. And people go, it's only because they've got to pay off in a few quid and the rest of it. It's nothing to do with that. It's the last thing on their mind. It's just the release from the non-stop stress of being placed under scrutiny and losing every week. It takes its toll. Even if you think it doesn't, it takes its toll.
Most definitely. Well, I could quite happily chat for hours about this, but I'm conscious of your and my time. So are you able to summarize this into 3 key takeaways for the listeners?
From a sports psychology perspective, number 1 is trust. Everything you do in your job must be built around maintaining and improving trust with players and staff. Never, ever do anything which threatens the trust. Number 2 would be timing, because there are days when you can offer opinions and solutions and questions, but there's days when you simply have to withdraw backstage, as I call it. And the third one would be also always look after your own energy and health and well-being and all that goes with it, because this job is about giving and not taking, and it's never, ever, ever about you. It's about other people, and that in itself can be really tiring. So make sure that your own, even if you're 21 or 61, make sure that your own health is not compromised by the service you're trying to provide.
Fascinating. No, they're fantastic tips there, Michael. I really appreciate that. If any listeners want to reach out to you, whereabouts can they find you?
They can drop me an email, to which I can never say this. I promise you I will, because that's a fatal mistake. But if they emailed me to Michael at Just Caulfield, all one word, Just Caulfield, CAULFIELD.com, then please do. And if they've got a question, a query, a thought, an insight, a point to raise, I will always try and get back to them. It's Michael at justcaulfield.com.
Brilliant. I'll put your email address into the show notes as well for people.
If they want to know about nature, dog walks, and the beautiful barn owl that's beautifully somehow has managed to choose my garden as its point of rest at the minute, they could follow me on Twitter, which is at the Caulfield Way. Sorry about that. .com. They could follow me on Instagram, but I've never posted anything, and I'm not on TikTok or anything else like that. And LinkedIn wouldn't be my preferred method of communication because it gets lost in a jungle of jargon, and I don't do that either. So email me. If you want pictures of my dog and the barn owl and everything else, follow me on Twitter, which I use for talking about fresh air, exercise, dog walks and nature.
Love it. A big thank you, Michael.
My pleasure. It's been fun, David.
Thanks. What a podcast episode. Yet another one, which I loved. It was fantastic to chat with Michael. And looking back, I'm going to pinch a word that he used a number of times: courage. As he mentioned, as a sports psychologist, we need courage in certain situations to challenge people, to drive endless miles on the hope that we might get some work. A football manager needs courage in different situations when their team's struggling, perhaps, or with their team selection. A football player needs courage to demand the ball when things aren't going well. And if we're honest with ourselves, regardless of age, sport, or profession, failure, rejection, criticism, it's all around us. We need ounces and pounds of courage. And the mentally tough person, they're much better able to deal with these types of challenges more smoothly. They're less likely to be derailed. Now, it doesn't mean that a mentally tough person won't face these challenges. That's just not going to happen. They're going to face them, but they've got a certain mindset, a certain attitude that's going to help them through these times. So when we think about mental toughness, let's break it down into the 4 C's. Let's start with commitment. A mentally tough person, be it a manager, player, sports psychologist, they're not going to give up. They're going to keep trying and trying until. However, they're going to get the balance right. They're going to be savvy enough to know when to take a break, to have a rest from time to time too, if that's going to serve them better to attain their goal. Now let's look at confidence, another C. Yes, a mentally tough person's confidence might be shaken by things, by failures. However, they're going to be aware of their enablers, their sources of confidence. In other words, they know where they get confidence from on a day-to-day level. So they're going to be able to place their focus in key routines, key processes that are likely to have a positive influence on their confidence levels. Now let's look at control. Often with challenges, with criticism, with failure, people can get lost. They can be helpless. So my role as a sports psychologist is to hand over some control to them so that they can take ownership of the problem, of the challenge, and to work out a damn good plan to get themselves through it. And when another challenge, when another failure, when another problem hits them, we also look to make sure that they've got some strategies up their sleeve so they're less likely to be derailed further down the track. And then last but not least, we've got that word challenge, that last C. The mentally tough person, again, will have some key processes in their toolkit. So when it comes to learning from these situations, from these events, they'll be able to do it. They'll be able to reflect. They'll be able to have conversations with relevant parties, relevant people in order to turn things around positively. They're also likely to be the type of person who shows that courage again, that bravery to get on the ball in a match when things aren't going well, to take some risks, not to play the ball backwards or sideways all the time. And as a football manager, they might bring some young players in perhaps, or some other players, and change selection as a way to shake things up, as opposed to playing the same team time and time again. Or, again, as Michael alluded, as a sports psychologist, they'll take that risk to drive 300 or 500 miles on the off chance that something might just occur. So, on that note, to finish this podcast episode, I want you to have a little think about courage. I'd like you to ask the question of yourself, what does courage mean to you? If you were courageous, if you placed all judgments to one side, all fears to one side, what impact would that have on your life or on your sport? And then let's just flip that the other way. If you continue doing what you do now, what impact is that going to have on your life and on your sport? What does being fearful mean to you? What do you look like when you are being fearful on the pitch, on the course, on the court, in the office? What needs to change? And if we think about the thought processes of that brave, that courageous person, what do you need to think like in these different situations? Think about it, and why not take it up a notch? Get a pen and a bit of paper out there and make some notes. I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed this episode as much as I have, and have a fantastic week ahead. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sports psychology resources. The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.